everyone, and welcome to episode 244 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cebulski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. Protection rackets are as old as time, and it's comfy for us today to think of them as relics of the past. But we know that sometimes the very people we trust to help us keep law and order are still wolves in sheep's clothing. In the medieval world, a powerful position which could easily lend itself to violence and corruption was the church advocate. This week, I spoke with Dr. Jonathan Lyon about advocates and what they can tell us about power in the Middle Ages. Jonathan is professor of history at the University of Chicago and the author of Princely Brothers and Sisters, the Sibling Bond in German Politics, 1100 to 1250, which won the John Nicholas Brown Prize from the Medieval Academy of America. And Noble Society, 5 Lives from 12th Century Germany. His new book is Corruption, Protection, and Justice in Medieval Europe, a 1,000-Year History. Our conversation on the role of medieval advocates, how they shaped justice for everyday people, and what this means to our understanding of the modern world is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Jonathan, for coming on and talking to me about basically protection rackets in the Middle Ages. I love it. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here.
So this book is really rooted around a specific why, I think. So why did you write this book?
That's a good question. There's a bit of a long answer to it because I wrote my first book about noble families, and in particular about siblings, brothers and sisters, and their relationships within these noble families. And I kept running across this particular job that some of these nobles had, which was called advocate. And it had something to do with authority over land, exercising justice, sort of military responsibilities over property. But I never could wrap my head around what the term really meant. And I could never find any kind of scholarship that told me what the term meant. And so when I finished that book, I decided to go looking to try to figure out for myself what this term advocate really meant. And 10 years later, I'm still not sure I have an answer, but I did enormous amounts of research. And when I sat down to write the book, I really realized that, okay, this is an incredibly obscure, esoteric topic. And I really need to come up with some way to broaden this out. And so I really started to think about what are the bigger topics that this seemingly small role of advocate touches on. And that's when I really sort of started to dig through my notes and to do a lot of reading around the topic of government and state formation and office holding, and really sort of built up this idea that I wanted to say something much bigger about the problem of good government out of this small job.
Right, exactly. And I think one of the big things that you're saying about government now is that at least our idea of democratic government and stuff is not inevitable and maybe not even as indestructible as we think. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's exactly right. I think one of the big stories historians like to tell is about the precociousness and the early success of European state formation and government. This is part of that grand narrative of the Western tradition, right? The rise of the West. Something about the distinctiveness of the Western state is part of that story. And it usually starts sometime between 1200 and 1600. It depends which historian you ask, right? But the rise of the state is a big part of that story. And it tends to be, as you say, a story of sort of inevitability, of it just keeps getting better and better. And what I'm trying to argue in the book is that these structures and institutions are not at all inevitable and not at all permanent, that maintaining a strong state, maintaining good government takes a lot of work because people frequently put their personal, familial interests ahead of the public good.
It's so true. People are grifters. You can't trust them. And so when you're talking about advocates, and again, we're going to get into what this means and what you found, or what the closest we can get to what this means. Some of the terms that you throw out in the introduction of the book are things like we have adjacent or similar ideas, perhaps in mafias or gangs or warlords. We think about people who are working towards their own profit. And some of them are given legit jobs and are still working towards their own profit. So why are you comparing advocates to warlords, mafias, gangs?
I think a big part of that is this comes back to the issue of how we think about state formation in Europe and the West more broadly. And one of the words that we tend to throw around is bureaucracy, right? That we think in terms of bureaucrats. And what is a bureaucrat? Well, a bureaucrat means someone who has clearly defined official duties. We all know what their job is supposed to be. They're not supposed to have been picked because of nepotism, family connections, patronage systems, friends got them jobs, right? They're supposed to be qualified because of some kind of training or education for that office. And that's a very modern concept. I mean, that's really a post 1800 ideal of what a government worker is supposed to be. So what I found in my research is, again and again, these people who were holding something that was called an office of advocate. But when you actually look at what they were doing, well, guess what? Most of them were not remotely qualified to do all the things they were supposed to do. They were frequently inheriting this job. So it was not about their own qualifications. It was about dad had the job, uncle had the job, they get the job. And so that's why I started to look around outside of the European tradition for other ways in which we see governments work around the world that aren't based on our ideal of a bureaucrat. And that's where I started to pull in mafia type structures, where I started to think about people who, may call themselves governors, but who are, for all intents and purposes, just the local regional war leader for this region or that.
Mm-hmm. I think that the idea of qualifications is really important because in the Middle Ages, as for some groups like what I'm thinking of is mafias, for example, the qualification is the bloodline. That is a qualification. In the Middle Ages, that is the qualification that you need. So qualifications is an interesting word when we're coming at ideas about offices and your responsibility to the people around you.
That's right. And I think we're all used to, even if you just sort of have the basic sort of feudalism knowledge of the Middle Ages, feudal pyramid kind of thing, we're all used to that idea that, well, nobles, yeah, they inherited their land, they inherited their jobs from their fathers or from other relatives. But the question is, well, when do we replace that system with something that is much more akin to what we think of as a modern bureaucracy? And that's a big question. And that's really where sort of my intervention is, where most historians want to put that transition somewhere between, let's say, 1500 and 1800. And a big part of my argument is to say no, that you really have to go into the 19th century to see that transition away from nepotism, patronage structures, client-patron relationships kinds of things, to something that looks much more like what we idealize as government bureaucracy.
Right. I think that is important work to be doing to reopen arguments a lot of the time. And I feel like that's a lot of what medieval studies is doing right now is reopening old arguments. So for this work that you're doing, you're sort of deliberately moving away from places like England and France, and you're moving sort of recentering towards German lands. Why did you choose to do this?
Well, part of this is I was trained as a German historian, so it's just sort of where I feel most at home.
Mm-hmm.
But like most Americans who learn to love the Middle Ages and end up wanting to study it, I did start by learning about England and France. And that's really where that story of the rise of the nation state is most deeply embedded. We think Magna Carta, 1215, okay, we have Parliament, we have the state in England, et cetera, et cetera. So, one of the reasons the book emphasizes so much the German-speaking lands, and that's not only modern Germany, but Austria, Switzerland, parts of what are now Eastern France, the Low Countries. It's sort of that big sort of geographical hodgepodge east of France, let's just sort of say. But, a big reason why I focus on this area is precisely because it doesn't fit neatly that story in the West about the rise of the nation state. This is the Holy Roman Empire, so it's a very large, heterogeneous part of Europe that defies that story of once the nation state gets going, it just keeps going and going and developing and developing. this relatively minor, or what seems like a relatively minor office of advocate, once you start digging deeper into it and seeing how widespread it was, you start to realize it tells a very different story about the development of Europe than the one we typically get with England and France.
Well, this is a perfect opportunity to say, what is the office of the advocate? Because it's something that seems to shift and change quite a lot. What did you discover? What is this office?
So we have to start by saying your listeners may be familiar with the word advocate from a modern legal context, right? It's not quite a lawyer, but of course, you can hire an advocate to go to court to speak for you on your behalf, someone who knows technical aspects of the law for a minor or for someone who cannot legally stand for themselves. So there is this modern notion of the advocate. And actually, there are some connections between that and the advocates I'm talking about if we go all the way back to the ancient Roman Empire. But the advocates I'm talking about develop a little bit differently. When we start to find them in the sources in abundance is the 8th century. So especially in the Frankish Empire, this is the empire of Charlemagne, so modern day France, Germany, the Low Countries, northern Italy. And initially their job does seem to be, at least in part, a legal one, that they are going to court and representing, in particular, churchmen, abbots, bishops, abbesses, speaking for them in court. In particular, it seems, over property questions. If there is a dispute about property ownership, because all of these churches are enormous landholders in this period, they are going to court to defend or make claims over property. And what I argue in the book is that from this seemingly simple and narrow job, we start to see how this snowballs as these advocates play around with the role and start to do more and more with it. And essentially, over the course of the 800s and 900s, it looks like what they're doing is becoming the chief judicial and legal agent on these churches' properties. And essentially what they're doing is saying, okay, if there's any question about property rights, if there's any question about how much income these properties should be getting, if there's any question about who owns particular people on these estates, who owns the serfs on this or that property in this or that village, they're the ones who step in to play a role in these kinds of cases. And then it just keeps snowballing from there. And essentially, one of the driving arguments of the book is that this is a very bottom-up story, not a top-down story. Kings, bishops, noblemen, they may have an idea about what they think these advocates should be doing, but the advocates themselves, left to their own devices, are going to creatively come up with all kinds of other things they can be doing. And so they start to essentially, and this is where the idea of the protection racket comes in, they essentially start to take upon themselves all kinds of judicial and military roles on church property, on other people's property like aristocrats, or even on king's properties at the local level, and say, I'll exercise justice, I'll collect taxes, I'll build castles to make sure these lands are safe or being protected. And this is where this idea comes in that on the one hand, this is called an office in our sources. On the other hand, when you really go into the sources and say, what do these people do? On a day-to-day basis, what are they actually doing? Not what they're supposed to be doing, what are they actually doing? You really get this strong sense of, the word I use is corruption, right? That they are, for all intents and purposes, finding ways to collect money for themselves and their families in any way possible off of these other people's properties.
I do want to come around to the creative ways that people do that, but I think that it begs the question, if we have people who are sort of administering or working or advocating for the church, why do they need that in the first place? Why isn't an abbot just going and taking care of business himself, or a bishop? Why do you need an advocate in the first place?
Great question. And there's two answers to this. The most common one, and it's certainly absolutely correct, is, as we all know, Christian leaders are not supposed to be themselves participating in violent acts. They are not supposed to organize military endeavors themselves. They're not supposed to ride into battle themselves. They're not supposed to draw a sword and physically defend their property from someone attacking it. Now, all of these things did happen in the Middle Ages, we know that, but in theory, at least, churchmen are not supposed to spill blood in this way. And they're also not supposed to preside over courts in which capital punishment is handed down. Obviously, an abbot or bishop or a local priest, anybody is not supposed to find someone guilty and sentence them to death. So what that means is when you're a churchman and you are in a possession of enormous numbers of estates, you have villages that belong to your church, you have towns that belong to your church, and the people there need to be protected, and justice needs to be exercised there. You have to find someone else to do it. And typically what you're going to do is find the nobleman who's your neighbor, who has the military expertise, who sits in judgment over his own people, and therefore has all the necessary training and skill to do that for you too. But of course, what you're essentially doing then is letting the fox into the henhouse. You're taking someone who quite possibly is, in fact, more politically powerful than you are and saying, will you come onto my land and do all these things for me? And that just opens up all kinds of problems.
Yeah, it's making me think of, the fox in the hen house, but also, you have to invite a vampire in. But once you invite the vampire in, they are in, and then you're in trouble.
Exactly. Right. Exactly.
But you can see how the messiness occurs because technically the king or the emperor or the lord is in charge of justice, but at the same time on church lands it's supposed to be the church involved in that justice. So then it gets to be so messy when you have people involved. So if the church needs someone to represent them or conduct justice for them, how are they choosing these people? So you're saying they just go out and invite their neighbor to do it? How are these advocates chosen?
So this is one of the stories I trace. And early on, when we look at the earliest advocates from the 700s, the 800s, it's really hard to say. But it seems from the sources we do have that these churchmen have the power to pick someone that they trust and that the king's courts approve of as someone who can play this role. And from what we can tell from the early sources, these are not the most prominent, powerful people in the neighborhood. They tend to be educated people who are at court anyway, who have the necessary skill to step in and say, I can play this role for you. But they don't seem to be the most powerful person on the block. But this starts to change in the 900s. And then when you get to the years past 1000, it becomes much easier to see that this becomes an appealing job for those powerful noblemen, counts, dukes. And whether or not they're pushing themselves on the churches or whether the churches are inviting them in, this is the age of the Vikings. So whether it's the fact that the church is saying, well, actually, we really do need the most powerful guy on the block to play this role because otherwise we don't have a way to defend our church property. We can trace over the course of the 900s and early 1000s this shift to counts and dukes really becoming most common as advocate. And then once that happens, they don't let it go. And what they end up doing is turning these offices into hereditary property. And it's very clear in the 11th and 12th centuries that churches, they keep saying, we have the right to freely choose our own advocate. It is not an inheritable office, but the records show it's an office that is being handed down inside these noble families, generation after generation after generation.
I think that is very relatable when we look at those comparisons that you made to warlords or cartels or things like that, where you say you have a choice. On paper, you have a choice, perhaps, but you don't really have a choice there.
Exactly. And you can wave around all kinds of legal documents that say, see, we have a choice. But when the other person in this relationship is, in fact, in many ways the stronger one, that piece of parchment isn't really going to do enough to stop them.
Yeah, it's not really a shield, not much of a shield anyway. So it's important to establish that this role, it's not a voluntary role. You do actually get paid for this. So can you tell us a little bit about the payment that people got for the role of advocate?
Right. And this obviously opens up this bigger problem of the corruption that comes behind the office. So some of it is very clear cut. in terms of what they're supposed to get paid. And essentially, when an advocate held court on a church's lands or on someone else's lands, they were to be paid 1/3 of any fines that had to be paid by the people who come before that court. So that's very clear cut. Of course, we know the problem. Our judges are not paid on the basis of a percentage of whatever fines they levy, because it's a bad idea. It obviously incentivizes you to fine people. And in fact, this is something I emphasize in the book. Other historians who really emphasize criminal justice in the Middle Ages also point this out. We like to think the Middle Ages is a very violent time where there's lots and lots of capital punishment. But the reality is the judge profits more from fines than from physically assaulting, if you will, criminals.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's very clear from our sources that lots and lots of these crimes that could be capital punishment crimes end up being commuted into fines because that's what's profitable for the judge. And so that's part of their payment that is problematic. And then there's other types of things that show up in our sources that really show how it gets out of hand. An advocate was supposed to come onto someone else's property either 1 time a year or 3 times a year to hold court. And when he did that, he came with some of his men, of course. He didn't show up alone. He rode in on horseback with a few other men. And he expected to be fed and he expected to be lodged while doing it. And so our documents, and this starts in the 11th century, and then we have it everywhere in the 12th and 13th centuries, it has to be spelled out very clearly, in some cases down to the exact number of eggs, what they were allowed to ask for food when they showed up to hold court. And so it's clear from these types of documents that they were coming up and basically demanding as much food as they could get for them and their men. And we also get documents that say, and when they come to hold court, they may only bring 10 people with them. They may only bring 10 horses with them. We're not feeding everybody in this guy's entourage every time he shows up. And so you see how this question of payment spirals into all these different types of possibilities. And then we know also that a big part of what they're being paid is just showing up with their entourage and basically demanding taxes, quote unquote, from the peasants that they're serving, that they're demanding far more from them than just judicial fines and a day's worth of food.
And you can see where the conflict starts to arise. Like if your advocate is coming into town, bringing all their horses, and they're asking to be fed and all of these things, you can see why you have some upset when people are like, we fed you, we paid the fines, and the Vikings are still coming and pillaging. What are we paying you for?
Absolutely, because and again, this is the problem with mafia-style protection rackets. It's the problem with relying on warlords. It's all well and good until they actually have to put their life on the line for someone else's peasants, because the Vikings are riding into this little village. They're not your people. You're just the advocate for this group of people. And now the question becomes, well, am I actually going to risk my life for these people? The answer frequently is no. This is a great job when you don't actually have to draw your sword and you're just collecting judicial fines and getting well fed when you show up.
I mean, you can see why people create a protection racket like that, because there are very little downsides as long as no one actually makes you do the protecting bit.
Exactly. And it's absolutely the same with the modern mafia, right? I mean, protection rackets are fine until, the government actually starts to come in and force your hand, and then it's not as fun a job.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you want me to work for this money? Come on.
Exactly.
Okay, so when we're talking about distributing justice, because that's the other half, and we have protection, we have justice. When we're talking about justice, what are we talking about? We kind of alluded to this a little bit, but what are the advocates doing in terms of justice in this role?
The first thing they're doing is combining two roles that we insist on keeping separate. And if you ever watched the TV show Law and Order, there's the law part and there's the order part. And it's a separate group of characters. And you do the police and then you do the attorneys.
Mm-hmm.
These guys are both. They are, for all intents and purposes, every judicial role we imagine rolled into one. They are both the police and the judges. Now, they're not juries. I mean, medieval courts, had other people who were there to judge guilt and innocence, but they were presiding over these law courts, and they were also pursuing criminals. By the later period, we know they're running prisons. So, they're the police, they're the prison wardens, and then they're the actual judges. And so they've got all of those things rolled into one. Another of the ways in which they are blurring the lines between what they're supposed to do and what they're actually doing is which crimes they do and don't judge. And so here again, our documents lay out very, very clearly, in most cases, that they're responsible for high justice. In other words, capital crimes, murder, sexual assault, theft, etc. And that they're frequently also responsible for property disputes. But petty kinds of crimes are usually supposed to stay in the hands of whoever the actual lord of the property is. But this is another of those complaints that we see showing up all the time. They come into this village and they oversee all kinds of criminal cases, even if they're not supposed to be the judge of that particular case. In most villages, again, this is one of those complicated things about how medieval justice worked. In many places, there are different lords who are overseeing different parts of the population. And so your average town, there might be 4 or 5 different lords, and different people will be under the judicial authority of different lords. But the advocate comes in and he doesn't care. He's judging everybody in this village or this town, even if those people are saying, whoa, you're not my judge. I'm not under your authority. They don't care. Every crime they can judge, they're going to judge. Any person they can judge, they're going to judge. And so this is one of the ways in which we see this role that, in theory, is tightly defined in our sources, spiraling out of control because these guys are just going to take advantage of it any way they can.
Yeah. And I mean, we're mostly talking about the bad actors. And I think that in some cases, probably the majority of people can be the bad actors, but sometimes it is a good thing. So one of the sentences I thought was interesting in your book is that sometimes people under a protection racket think it's a good thing. And when I'm thinking about this in terms of justice, if you have the Lord's justices that are going around and it's itinerant, maybe you want a quicker solution. Maybe you want that advocate to do that. But again, once you let the fox in the hen house, then you're in trouble.
Exactly. I mean, I do make a point to emphasize this, that this isn't necessarily a bad system for everybody. And I take this, in fact, from modern sociology, modern literature about the mafia and other types of protection rackets, where when you interview some of these people who are paying protection money to the mafia in Italy or in other places, many of them say they don't have any problem with the system because it's harder to get justice from the state than it is from your local mafia protection guy. And in fact, the mafia, sort of at its height when it was running these kinds of protection rackets, had a very good reputation at dispute resolution. They wanted their people to be paying regularly. And so if there were disputes that were slowing that down, they would intervene and they would solve these disputes and settle these disputes. And that's clearly what's going on with some of these advocates too, is they are trying to solve types of problems that will free up the money to flow to them, right? So that can be good in that way. And the other point that I make in the book is your landlord isn't necessarily always going to be the better protector and judge of you either. In some cases, the advocate might come into your village and really want to play nice with you because he wants to convince you to become followers of him and to, in fact, basically cast off your landlord and come under his permanent authority. And so we definitely have sources that suggest that local people are well aware of the fact that they can play off the advocate and their landlord, and that the advocate knows this, the landlord knows this, because we get plenty of sources with the landlord saying, when you come to hold court, I want to be there because I want to keep an eye on you and make sure you're not trying to be unusually nice to my people so that they'll follow you instead of me.
It's funny when we're talking about this, the comparisons that you make between modern institutions like the mafia where you have this violence that's meant to convince people in a lot of ways, and it's done very strategically. So it's not just willy-nilly, like heads being cut off everywhere. That's the thing about human violence, is it's usually strategic. It's usually for a reason. And it was very effective in some of these cases, right?
Absolutely. I think you put it exactly right. Most human violence is very strategic. One of those scholarly trends that I push back against, it's an older one. It's not one that a lot of historians today talk about. But one of those trends is to talk about sort of feudal Europe as being anarchic and sort of out of control, that all of these local counts and dukes and barons and knights were just able to run around and do anything they wanted and just slaughter peasants and carry out every crime under the sun. And there was no one to stop them because kings were too weak until kings get stronger later in European history. And that's just not true. And the reason it's not true is the same reason why gangs aren't incredibly violent, why the mafia is not incredibly violent. Anarchy is bad for business. It's bad for any kind of.
That should be on a t-shirt, I think. Anarchy is bad for business. It's true,
It
though.
is, but right? Because if you want to know that you have a stable income, whether it's from protection rackets or from some kind of other criminal operation, drug dealing, whatever, you need stability. You need stability in your clientele to know that you're going to keep bringing in that income. Because it's the people who don't think in those terms, the people who do just go into a village and burn it down. What have you done in the long term to keep the revenue coming in? And people in the Middle Ages were smart enough to know that too, that you wanted to offer just enough protection, offer just enough justice to keep things stable and to keep these people paying you when you showed up. And that was the goal.
Yeah, you can't bite the hand that feeds you in some ways. It's a symbiotic relationship, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So say you have a bad advocate, they're terrible, they're just doing all sorts of things that are oppressive. What do you do about it? Who can you go to? Who do you call?
You've got a couple of options. The first one, obviously, is to go to the landlord. And this might be an abbot, it might be a bishop, an abbess, and complain and see what they will do. And frequently what they will then do is go complain to the king, as you would imagine, because the king still, at least in theory, is somewhere up there as the head judge of the community, and anybody can appeal to him for this kind of violent behavior. The king may do something. The king may issue a document that tells the advocate to stop. But as you can imagine, kings have other things to do. What we're talking about in my book is very low-level office holding. We're talking about people who are playing this role of advocate in a small town for the most part, or in a couple of villages on rural estates. A king is not going to show up to deal with this kind of low-level problem personally, right? Like I say, you might get the abbot or the bishop might get a document that he can then go wave in the face of the advocate and say, the king tells you to stop. But whether or not that's enough to convince the advocate to stop is an entirely different question. So we have lots of evidence of that. We have lots of evidence of people going all the way up to the king to try to stop these advocates, but that's not always very effective. And so starting in the 13th century, and this is something that really becomes clearer and clearer in the sources, the most common way to deal with bad advocates is to buy them off, is to essentially go to them and say, if I offer you a lump sum of money, will you stop being advocate? Will you just vacate the office, turn it over to me so that I can pick someone else that I like better, that I think will do a better job? How much money will it take for you to just resign your office? And we get a lot of examples of advocates doing this because they need the money. Because in the 13th century, 14th, we know this right through European history, nobles and aristocrats are usually in debt. It's an expensive lifestyle. War horses, armor, all the most up-to-date military stuff is expensive. You have to maintain a large household. That's expensive. You have to keep up with your neighbors in terms of throwing the best parties and patronizing literature and artists and things like that. It's expensive. And so sometimes they are very tempted to give up this office in return for large lump sum payments of cash.
And why not? Why not? If you're in it for the cash anyway, get yourself paid.
Exactly. And it's one of those things that I think, again, maybe goes against what people think about the Middle Ages when you think about noble lineages. Yes, these aristocrats are recognizing that they want to hand something down to their children and grandchildren, et cetera, but they also have to worry about their own lifetimes. And the reality is, if they're that deeply in debt, they're going to accept these kinds of offers, even if it means that their son is going to inherit less, because the priority is their lifetime, not their son's lifetime.
Well, I also think it's probably tempting to dismiss this kind of payout because if you have that idea of the Middle Ages as being a hyper-violent time, you think if you're going to go up against the Lord, he's just going to cut your head off and then, there is no problem. But the idea of accepting payment for resigning, I mean, that's a very human thing to do. It's very recognizable. Of course, why wouldn't you take the
Absolutely.
cash, right? Instead of escalating that violence, because once you start down that path, well, then you have to maintain it. Then you have to actually put your money where your mouth is. That's dangerous. Who wants to do that?
Absolutely, right. And if you do start to worry that the king may intervene, or that the abbot or bishop may go find someone else who will up the ante in terms of the physical states of this type of situation, then yeah, there again, you may think, you know what, better to take the money now because I'm starting to realize that this bishop has enough friends that maybe he is going to try to take this back from me by force.
Yeah, make the smart decision. So before we wrap up, one of the things that you mentioned is that you spent some time working from 1500 to 1800. Why did you want to extend this past the Middle Ages?
So that wasn't originally my plan. um, this was supposed to be a smaller book, but one of the opportunities I had while I was in Europe conducting research for this book was to visit various local archives. And some of them have done a better job than others of putting all of their collections online so you can really see everything that they have. And so I just happened to be visiting this one archive in Austria, and I saw that they had documents about a dispute between an advocate and an abbot in the 17th century. And this surprised me. It was not something I expected to find. But when I did find it, I said, well, might as well sit down and look at these documents. And then I found other examples of disputes between advocates and churches and kings in the 18th century. One of the people I end up talking about in the book is King Frederick the Great of Prussia, who gets into a dispute with an abbess about an advocate, the office of advocate, in the 1740s. And I thought, well, what is going on here? This is not what I expected to find. Because all the scholarship had told me that these advocates, they really sort of, their heyday was the 12th and 13th century, but after that, the role steadily declines. And so it was really a case of, going into the archives, what I always tell my students to do. Don't trust what historians tell you. Go into the archives and really see what the sources tell you. And the more digging around I did, the more I realized that this was a much longer story than I thought it originally was, and that these advocates were continuing to cause problems in the 17th and 18th centuries when most historians tell you the state is definitely there and that the state should be limiting these kinds of rogue local office holders. But here they are, still doing, in many ways, the same things I saw them doing in the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. And so that's what made me decide to push into the later period, and what really forced me to make an argument that really questions, down to the year 1800, the whole story of the rise of the state in Europe.
Right. And one of the things that you reflect on in the introduction and the conclusion, as we wrap this up, is that some of these ideas about people having protection rackets are still with us today. So looking at this work that you've done on advocates, looking at the modern world, what is it that you want to leave people with when it comes to thinking about the ways in which people deal with protection and justice and have done for hundreds of years?
Yeah, I think the number one takeaway, and as you say, it's something I really push in the conclusion, is that state formation isn't easy. Building good government, even in Europe where we say, oh, well, they seem to have figured out how to do this, it's hard. And you can never turn your back on anti-corruption programs. You can never turn your back on ideas about how do we train bureaucrats, office holders to do their jobs the right way. You can't just assume that we've all accepted that this is how we do things now, and that every local agent of justice, every local police officer, et cetera, just now somehow has it hardwired in their brains that we're all supposed to be accountable office holders now. Throughout the Middle Ages, and this is another thing that I mentioned in the book, we have plenty of examples of kings, bishops, dukes trying to hold their advocates accountable. The documents abound with ways in which they try to tell these people, stop doing this, this is the right way to do your job. And yet, century after century, the same problems come up. Really, the takeaway for me is these things don't stop. It's impossible to build a state or a government so perfectly that we can all just step back and then just let it run. And everybody knows how to do it, and everybody will do it the right way. You always have to be paying attention to proper education, proper preparation, proper qualifications to create the right kind of ethos so that people will do their jobs the way we all want them to and expect them to.
I love that. Questioning the idea that we have evolved and we've reached the pinnacle and it's just going to stay that way forever.
Exactly. That's right. And I think that's a trap we tend to fall into.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and complicating this all for us so that we can see what history has looked like to this point and how it shapes us today. So thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you. It was great fun. I really enjoyed the conversation.
To find out more about Jonathan's work, you can visit his faculty page at the University of Chicago. His new book is Corruption, Protection, and Justice in Medieval Europe, a 1,000-Year History. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on, Peter?
Hey. Well, we have an update since you just interviewed Jonathan. News came out since that interview that he has been awarded the 2024 Otto Grundler Prize for his book, Corruption, Protection, and Justice in Medieval Europe.
That's huge. Congratulations to Jonathan.
Yeah, the Otto Grundler Prize is one of those bigger awards given out at the Medieval Congress at Kalamazoo. So you're getting award-winning authors.
I know. It's one of the biggest prizes in medieval studies. So yeah, that's a big deal. Thank you for giving us that update.
Indeed. So more news we have this week. There's an interesting bit of information about a horse trade that was taking place from like Scandinavia to the Baltics during the late Viking Age. And there's two fascinating things about it. First, this was between Christians and pagan peoples, right? The Christians from Sweden and Finland sending over the horses to non-Christians. And then second of all is that the pagans were using it for their burial ceremonies.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
That's not where I thought you were going with that.
Yeah. So they bring them in and down you go. So instant glue factory in a way.
Wow. Well, I guess then it doesn't really matter so much if it's a cross-cultural thing. You're like, well, horse is going to die anyway.
Yeah. So we have the news about that. Plus we have this really kind of fun piece about medieval expressions and some of the stuff that has come down from Middle Ages that we still say today.
I love those ones. The little proverbs that people say all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. My favorite one is lick into shape.
Is that about bears?
That's right. In bestiaries, bears were thought that when they overwinter hibernated and gave birth to the cubs were just like a massless clump, and it had to be licked. Their faces and stuff like that, and the arms would all kind of appear. There's crocodile tears.
Oh, really? That's that old. I didn't realize.
Apparently, the idea that crocodiles would be crying when they ate their victims. And we also have food for worms, which I thought would be like some gangland Las Vegas phrase, but it's actually from the Anchor Weiss, that monastic text. They kind of just mentioned that's what your body's going to wind up as. So
yeah,
concentrate on the soul, everyone.
Yeah, a book written for anchorites. Well, it does appear, I'm pretty sure, in Shakespeare's Henry IV as well. Where
That
Percy Hotspur is food for worms. Yeah, beautiful. I love that we have all of these idioms that are still coming out today because there are always ones that we keep discovering that are so much older than we expected. I love this stuff.
I love finding books that talk about that, and I came across a couple, so yeah, I had some fun putting that together.
That's awesome. Well, thank you, Peter, for telling us all about it and stopping by to tell us all the things on the website.
Thanks.
Episode 2 of my new narrative podcast series, This is History Presents the Iron King, dropped this week, featuring Philip the Fair's so-called evil stepmother, an uppity pope, a showdown with Edward Longshanks, and a diabolical use of medieval soap. And if you want more history and even more nerdy content, you can subscribe to This is History Plus and listen to this week's bonus episode where I'm a little salty about Thomas Aquinas, and Dan Jones gives his thoughts on whether Philip the Fair is to blame for all the bad decisions he makes in his reign. You can find This is History wherever you're listening to this podcast, and I really hope you enjoy it. As I mentioned last week, it's the 100th anniversary of the Richard III Society this year, and as part of the Canadian celebration, I'll be giving a talk at the Centenary Luncheon at Montgomery's Inn in Toronto on Saturday, July 6th. If you're interested in hearing my talk and you won't be in Toronto, that's okay, because the event will also be available on Zoom. Ticket sales will close on June 15th, so get your RSVP in ASAP. To find out more, please visit Richard III, that is richardii.ca/branch-news. And is there more news? Yes, there is, because some of you have kindly been emailing both me and Peter from medievalist.net because you're interested in taking my online course, Calamity and Change, an introduction to the 14th century. And because you've asked so nicely, I'm offering it again in September. You can pre-order it at medievalstudies.thinkific.com or just stay tuned as we get closer to the fall. And now it's time to thank you all for your support, especially if you're a patron on patreon.com, because patrons are what allow this podcast to happen in the first place. If you'd like to become one of these everyday superheroes, please head over to patreon.com/medievalists. Or if you'd like to support my work another way, you can visit tpublic.com/stores/medievalistnet to pick up some sweet medieval merch and show off your awesomeness in the street. Either way, you always have my love and gratitude. For everything from rackets to crickets, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or X at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Sobalski, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself an amazing day.